Hello, my Life Science 7A kids. This is Mr. Escox coming back to you. Excuse me. Make sure we are starting chapter 12 today. Make sure that you have your Science World turned in. Make sure you have your vocab for the 12 turned in. And today we are talking about energy roles in an ecosystem. And then you have some questions on page 279. So, what are producers and consumers? Now, when we did biomes, we talked a little bit about producers and consumers. A producer is something that can make its own food, so it's got to be photosynthetic. That means using sunlight to create sugars. So, these are going to be plants. It could be algae in a pond, or it could be like phytoplankton in the ocean. If you know anything about the ocean, phytoplankton really makes our oxygen for here on Earth. It's the basis of almost all of the upper food level chains. Consumers like us have to eat other organisms. So, you guys talked about your polar bears and things in the tundra. Those are consumers. Now, a polar bear can eat both plants and animals, although most polar bears really eat seals and fish. The bears that we have here in Pennsylvania eat a lot of plants, grubs, and then whatever types of animals they can catch, fawns, deer, small animals of that nature. Herbivores, like bunny rabbits and deer, eat plants. The prefix herb actually in its Latin origin means plants, and avore, the vor part means to eat. So eating plants. This means to eat. Carne, like carne asada, if you've ever ordered that at a Mexican restaurant, means meat. Actually, it means steak in a restaurant. This means to eat. And omni means many or multiple. We humans are omnivores. There are a couple more types of consumers that we have to talk about. So, herbivores eat plants, carnivores eat meat, like lions kill and eat a zebra. And then, after the zebras are done being eaten, they may get fed on by scavengers. Now, scavengers save a lot of energy by feeding on dead things: vultures, hyenas, ants, beetles, crows, worms. Um, when you feed on something that's already dead, and even like wild dogs of different types, wolves and things, will become scavengers because you don't waste the energy of having to kill the organism. And then once the scavengers are done picking what they want, you need the decomposers to cycle the material back into the soil so that those materials, those atoms, those carbon, all of that nitrogen can be reused. Again, your biggest types of decomposers are going to be your bacteria and your fungi. Here's a vulture, here's a crow, they're scavengers. So here's a picture that we used in the last chapter, and it asks about what are the producers and consumers in this picture. So your producers are here. You've got plankton, aquatic vegetation, which is just different types of seaweed. Those are your producers. The herbivores have to feed off of the plankton. So if you follow the arrows, they go this way. And then as different things become eaten, bivalves are like your clams and mussels, you work your way up to the different levels of consumers until you get to the top of the whole thing, what we call tertiary consumers, where you have the osprey and the eagle, which if you've ever seen them in the wild, they are absolutely beautiful. Part of your homework that goes with this section is to read this section here, the first section of chapter 12. It is page 278 and 279. Here's your key terms. It says, what are producers and consumers? Producer is an organism that makes its own food. Consumer is an organism that obtains food by eating other organisms. Herbivore, consumer that eats plants. Carnivore, consumer that eats animals. Omnivore eats both plants and animals. Scavenger that eats dead organisms, and decomposer that breaks down the wastes or remains of other organisms. Almost all energy that is used in living things comes from the sun. Organisms that use the sun's energy to make their own food are called producers. On land, the main producers are plants. The main producers in lakes and oceans are algae and phytoplankton. So if you were going producers over here in figure 12-2, you got trees and ferns and vines and things like that. So it has to be the plants there. Consumers, most types of organisms cannot make their own food. Instead, they get energy by eating other organisms. An organism that eats another organism is a consumer. Some consumers eat only plants. They are called herbivores. Rabbits are herbivores. They eat grass and other plants. Some consumers only eat animals. They are called carnivores. Lions are carnivores because they eat other animals. Other consumers are omnivores. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. Humans are omnivores because we eat both plants and animals. Why is a human considered an omnivore? Well, because even if you don't like your vegetables, we eat bread. Okay, bread, pasta, all comes from grasses that we know as wheat. If you eat a lot of meat, that's different types of animals that have been killed to process for us. Levels of consumers. A primary consumer is an organism that eats producers. Most herbivores are primary consumers. Caterpillars eat leaves and other plants. They are primary consumers. Organisms that eat primary consumers are secondary consumers. Tree frogs eat plants eating animals, eat small plant eating animals such as caterpillars and butterflies. The tree frogs are secondary consumers. Consumers that eat secondary consumers are called tertiary consumers. Toucans are birds that eat small meat-eating animals such as tree frogs and snakes. Toucans are tertiary consumers. So in this picture, the producer is the tree, the primary consumer is the butterfly, the secondary consumer here is the tree frog, and the tertiary is the toucan. Some animals, such as toucans, are both secondary and tertiary. Most humans are primary, secondary, and tertiary. Just depends on what you're eating. Squirrels eat seeds and small insects or animals. Are squirrels primary, secondary, or tertiary? Most of the time, squirrels eat different types of nuts. Most of the time, squirrels eating nuts makes them primary. If for some reason the squirrels were eating insects, then it would be making them probably a secondary. Scavengers and decomposers. Some animals feed on dead animals. These animals are scavengers. Scavengers eat animals that have died or been killed by other animals. Vultures, hyenas, and certain ant, beetles, and worms are scavengers. Scavengers can be both secondary and tertiary consumers. Organisms that break down the wastes or remains of organisms are decomposers. Decomposers return materials from dead organisms to the soil and air and water. Most bacteria and fungi are decomposers. So if you had to list some organisms that were scavengers, that goes back to your crows, your vultures, your hyenas. Sometimes wolves or coyotes can be scavengers. This has been converted to a Google form for you. Producers use energy from the blank to make their own food. Well, where do we get most of our energy from? The sun. Some producers in lakes are, well, we do have some plants, some seaweeds. The big producer in lakes are algae and phytoplankton. Organisms that eat the remains of dead organisms are scavengers. Organisms that eat only producers are primary consumers because they're eating the first level, or you can call them herbivore. I'd be all right with that. Secondary consumers are eaten by, well, second comes third, or tertiary consumers for number 5. What is one way in which organisms in an ecosystem depend on each other? It can be for food, it can be using the trees for shelter. Those are usually the most common. One organism eats the other. Plants capture the energy for the others. Give examples of when humans are primary, secondary, and tertiary. Well, if you're primary, you're eating a salad. You got lettuce and tomato. Those are plants, you're primary. Secondary consumer, when you eat your chicken nuggets at lunch, the chicken ate the corn from the farmer, and then you ate the chicken, so that makes you a secondary consumer. And a tertiary consumer could be maybe if you had salmon for dinner. Salmon feed on small fish, so they were secondary, and you ate the salmon, that makes you tertiary. And there are other reasons that you could be different types of tertiary consumers. Classify the following organisms as herbivore, carnivore, or omnivore. A black bear is an omnivore. A wolf, well, they typically only eat meat. They are carnivores. Horses like grass, hay, and different types of oats or grain. That makes them a herbivore. A hawk, well, hawks like to kill things like rabbits and mice and snakes. They are carnivores. Humans like us, well, we eat plants and animals. That makes us omnivores. A giraffe in Africa will eat the leaves of plants, making them a herbivore. A cat likes to eat cat food, but if you were in the wild, they eat mice, so that makes them a carnivore. And a cow eats grass, so it is a herbivore. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we went through a lot of things here today. Make sure you're doing your questions in Google Classroom. And until next time, I'll be seeing you on Mr. Hescox. Bye-bye.